What happens when the internet's most ruthless space, like a celebrity gossip forum, just suddenly transforms into this radically empathetic grief support group?
It's honestly a pretty rare thing to see.
It really is. Today, a breaking news alert didn't just interrupt our doom scrolling, it forced an entire generation to confront the dark reality of childhood stardom and, well, their own mortality. We are looking at the tragic news that actress Hayden Panettiere has died at the age of 36.
It's just 36. It really shatters the illusion of the digital time capsule. We tend to think of these child stars as, frozen in amber on our screens.
Right.
They're essentially immortalized in the roles we grew up watching. So
Yeah.
hearing about a sudden cardiac arrest, it forces the public to reconcile that fictional and vulnerable character with a very mortal human being.
Which is such a jarring experience when you are just idly scrolling on a Sunday afternoon. You're expecting a meme or a recipe, and suddenly you hit this jagged rock of permanent, heavy reality.
Exactly. It completely stops you in your tracks.
Well, and for our mission today, we aren't just going to recount the tragic timeline of a celebrity passing. We want to explore how a digital community collectively processes that kind of sudden grief, how they dissect the overwhelming complexities of addiction and the systemic failures that surround child actors.
And our source material for this deep dive provides a highly unique lens for it. We aren't analyzing a polished retrospective from like a traditional news network.
Right. No polished talking heads today.
No. We are diving into a singular, highly active thread from the Reddit community ARPUP Culture Chat, which is a space usually reserved for paparazzi photos and dating rumors.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because her trauma was so publicly documented, the audience on this subreddit didn't just read an obituary.
No, they didn't. They began actively mapping the circumstances of her final hours to the broader tragedies of her life.
But to understand how that community reacted, we have to start with the concrete, physical reality they were presented with on that Sunday.
Right. The initial reporting really acts as the scaffolding for the public's reaction. So based on the curated timeline in the thread, the crisis began just before 2:00 p.m. on a Sunday in Greenville, South Carolina.
And she had flown down from Los Angeles the previous day, right?
Yeah, she flew down on Saturday with her on-again, off-again boyfriend, Brian Hickerson, which places her far outside her usual Hollywood support network.
The 911 call is placed at 1:51 p.m. by a friend, reporting she is unresponsive and in cardiac arrest.
And if you've ever taken a basic CPR class, you know that standard chest compressions are essentially just about buying time.
Yeah, just trying to keep oxygen moving.
Exactly. But the reports meticulously note that emergency medical services initiated advanced cardiac life support.
Which is a massive escalation.
It is. They were throwing every modern chemical and mechanical intervention they had at her.
Like inserting breathing tubes, pushing emergency pharmaceuticals, utilizing advanced heart rhythm tracking. It paints this incredibly vivid, desperate picture of clinical intervention trying to reverse a catastrophic failure.
It really does. But despite those highly aggressive interventions, the timeline is tragically brief. She was pronounced dead at 2:32 p.m., just 40 minutes after the initial call.
Wow.
Yeah, and it's in the immediate aftermath of that pronouncement where the mechanics of breaking news start to create a vacuum.
That's exactly where I need to push back on the timeline of information, actually. Because the official statements released to the public are maddeningly ambiguous.
Oh, they always are with these initial reports.
Law enforcement issues a statement saying there are, quote, no initial signs of foul play, and the circumstances do not appear suspicious, and they scheduled the autopsy for Monday.
Which all sounds very standard.
But in the very same press release, they confirm there is an open investigation. As a reader, that feels entirely contradictory.
Yeah, it creates instant tension.
It sounds like a true crime podcast is setting the stage for a murder mystery while simultaneously telling us there's no mystery at all.
What's fascinating here is how standard bureaucratic language completely misfires in the digital age.
What do you mean?
From a purely administrative standpoint, an open investigation is standard protocol for this sudden, unattended death of a 36-year-old. The file simply cannot be legally closed until a coroner signs the final toxicology and autopsy reports.
So it doesn't imply a crime.
No, it doesn't imply homicide at all. But to a public conditioned by decades of sensationalized media, the phrase open investigation is a massive, ominous blank space.
And the internet cannot handle a blank space.
Oh, clever.
The subreddit instantly started filling that vacuum with any granular detail they could find. They latched onto a report from TMZ mentioning that she had been complaining of back pain over the past year.
Right.
Now, On its face, mentioning back pain in an article about a sudden death seems absurdly trivial. But I want to challenge whether the community's reaction to that detail is actually empathetic or just a sophisticated form of toxic gossip.
That's a fair question.
Because they immediately started speculating about opioids, drawing a direct line between back pain, a history of addiction, and an overdose. Isn't that just the same intrusive speculation we usually condemn?
It's an incredibly fine line these communities walk. Absolutely. But in this specific thread, the speculation wasn't malicious. It was rooted in pattern recognition.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
The users weren't hunting for a scandal. They were looking at a woman who had been fiercely open about her severe struggles with opioids and alcohol.
Right, she had spoken about it publicly.
Exactly. And in the context of addiction narratives, back pain is a notorious gateway for relapse. The community recognized that a relapse often strips a person of their tolerance, making the current, highly toxic drug supply fatal.
I see.
They were connecting the clinical reality of a cardiac arrest to the lifelong burden of her disease.
That shift in the thread from the clinical details of South Carolina to the lifelong burden she carried it really forces us to look at the psychological timeline.
It does. We have to examine the sheer weight of the spotlight she lived under.
Because we aren't just talking about a working actor, we are talking about someone whose cultural footprint was inescapable for an entire generation.
The ubiquity of her image cannot be overstated. Yeah. I mean, from voicing a main character in Pixar's A Bug's Life as a very young child.
I always forget how early she started.
So early. Then, Remember the Titans, Bring It On, and eventually becoming the literal face of the massive cultural phenomenon that was Heroes.
The phrase, save the cheerleader, save the world. It was printed on millions of t-shirts. She was everywhere.
She really was. And she went on to anchor Nashville and the Scream franchise. She even crossed over into major video games like Until Dawn.
For millennials and Gen Z, she was just this constant shimmering presence.
Which makes this stark contrast of her private reality even more devastating. The subreddit continuously references her recent memoir, This Is Me, A Reckoning.
Yeah, that book really changed how people saw her.
In it, she essentially dismantles that shimmering image. She details the immense psychological toll of childhood fame, her battles with severe mental health issues, and the crushing grief following the death of her 28-year-old brother, Jansen, just a year prior in 2023.
The commenters zero in on how candid she was about that grief. She wrote about carrying a profound, heavy guilt over Jansen's death.
Yeah, survivor's guilt can be overwhelming.
And that guilt wasn't isolated. It was layered on top of an incredibly toxic family dynamic. The thread spends a lot of time analyzing her estrangement from her mother, who operated as a textbook momager.
The quintessential stage parent.
Exactly. We're talking about a child pushed into acting before she could even form her first memories, treated less like a daughter and more like a corporate asset.
And the fallout from that dynamic was painfully public. When Hayden's memoir was published, her mother went to the tabloid press and claimed that Hayden had brought her 20 years of trauma.
I remember reading that. It's a staggering inversion of the maternal relationship, turning the child into the architect of the parent's suffering.
It's incredibly toxic.
Trying to conceptualize being a child star in that specific environment, it requires a shift in how we view fame. It isn't just about the pressure of having your picture taken. Building a life as a child star with a momager is like being placed inside a pressure cooker without a release valve.
That's a great way to put it.
The industry and the parents just keep turning up the heat. They expect you to perform continuously while internalizing intense family and public expectations.
Right, adding hit television shows, grueling global press tours, intense public scrutiny.
And the financial responsibility of providing for the whole family. They entirely ignore the fact that a child in that scenario doesn't develop a baseline identity outside of performance. Eventually, without a release valve, the pressure almost inevitably fractures them.
And that structural collapse became undeniably apparent when she attempted to build her own family. The thread highlights her relationship with former fiancé Vladimir Klitschko and the birth of their daughter, Kaya.
Yeah, that was a very dark period for her.
Following a traumatic birth, she plunged into severe postpartum depression. Because she lacked that fundamental psychological foundation, she didn't have the tools to navigate the immense vulnerability of early motherhood.
And the tragedy is how deeply she internalized that struggle. The Reddit users discuss how she desperately wanted to be a nurturing, present mother, basically the exact opposite of the mother she had.
Exactly.
When the postpartum depression blocked her from connecting with her daughter, she interpreted it as a personal moral failure. And to numb the crushing shame of that perceived failure, she turned heavily to alcohol and opioids.
This is where the depth of the subreddit's analysis becomes truly remarkable. It moves far beyond typical pop culture commentary.
What were they saying?
The users began discussing the physiological and psychological mechanisms at play. Several commenters pointed out the established medical link between maternal estrangement and postpartum depression.
Wow, I didn't even know there was a statistical link there.
There is. They started unpacking the concept of generational trauma and epigenetics, how the severe stress and trauma she endured as an exploited child literally wired her nervous system for hypervigilance.
Leaving her incredibly vulnerable to hormonal and psychological crashes later in life.
Exactly. It completely reframes her addiction. It wasn't a party lifestyle. It was a desperate attempt to self-medicate a nervous system that had been structurally compromised since infancy.
As one commenter put it, life had comprehensively stacked the cards against her. Every single major life milestone she hit was already poisoned by the unresolved trauma of the previous one.
Which brings us to the sociological phenomena of the Reddit thread itself. We are looking at a forum designed for rapid-fire gossip.
Oh yeah, usually a place that thrives on snark and superficial judgment.
Right. Yet, in the face of this specific tragedy, the environment radically transformed.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The moderators of Spark Culture Chat didn't just let the conversation run wild.
No, they took control immediately.
They actively engineered the environment by activating what they call only stands mode. They locked the thread, requiring users to have a minimum of 300 subreddit karma to leave a comment.
Which is brilliant.
Essentially, if you hadn't already spent significant time positively contributing to that specific community, you were locked out. They threw up a digital velvet rope.
That architectural choice by the moderators is brilliant from a sociological perspective. In the immediate hours of breaking news, the internet is flooded with bots, trolls, and people seeking the dopamine hit of leaving a controversial, cruel comment.
Yeah, the worst impulses of the internet.
By requiring 300 karma, the moderators stripped away the shield of complete anonymity. They instituted an economy of reputation. It forced users to comment not as anonymous provocateurs, but as invested members of a community, which entirely shifted the psychology of the discourse.
The result of that digital velvet rope is a thread overflowing with staggering vulnerability. You have people in their late 30s and 40s reading the news of a peer's death and suddenly being forced to look in the mirror.
Yeah, they aren't just mourning an actress. They are examining their own mortality.
Commenters were sharing deeply personal, painful stories about their own battles with addiction. People wrote raw admissions, saying things like, "I was a horrible, destructive drunk in my 20s, and I so easily could have been the one who didn't wake up."
It is a profound manifestation of parasocial grief. These users grew up alongside her.
Right.
When someone who has been a constant fixture in your cultural periphery dies so suddenly, it shatters your own sense of invulnerability. A user who mentioned they just turned 40 expressed this immense survivor's guilt, realizing they barely survived the same destructive coping mechanisms that ultimately claimed Hayden's life.
The thread doesn't just stop at personal reflection, though. The users scale their grief upward, launching into a massive systemic critique of the entertainment industry. They dissect the concept of the child star curse.
But they don't just use it as a buzzword or a superstitious label.
Exactly. They analyze the actual mechanism of the curse, comparing Hayden's mother to other famously abusive figures, like Jeanette McCurdy's mother.
And the consensus they reach is that the curse is actually just systemic, normalized child abuse.
Yeah.
It's the inevitable outcome of an industry that treats developing humans as disposable commodities.
And to prove that point, the community draws a brilliant contrast. They juxtapose the tragic trajectories of American child stars with the documented success of the Harry Potter cast.
Oh, that's such a great comparison.
A commenter highlighted that the producers of the Harry Potter films didn't merely audition the children, they aggressively evaluated the parents.
Right, looking for those red flags.
Yes. They audited the support systems, refusing to hire kids whose families showed signs of viewing them as meal tickets. They built an infrastructure specifically designed to shield the developing brains of their actors from the toxic radiation of global fame.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, that comparison highlights the profound lack of structural protection in Hollywood. The empathy flowing through this Reddit thread isn't just about feeling sad for a woman who struggled with addiction.
No, it's bigger than that.
It's an indictment of a system that placed a toddler on a conveyor belt of fame, allowed her protectors to become her exploiters, and then left her entirely alone to manage the resulting psychological fallout on a public stage.
And reading the anecdotes scattered throughout the thread just deepens that heartbreak. You have comments from people who encountered her outside the Hollywood bubble, hotel workers in Nashville, journalists who interviewed her, and the universal consensus is that she was incredibly kind, professional, and warm.
Yeah, just a genuinely good person.
People mentioned reading her memoir just days before her passing, feeling this immense sense of hope because she wrote about finally doing the hard work of healing.
The collective reaction is one of being robbed. The public had witnessed her descent, but they were deeply invested in her redemption arc. They wanted her to be the one who finally beat the systemic odds stacked against her.
So what does this all mean? When we pull back from the minute-by-minute timeline, the medical interventions, and the police statements, we are forced to reckon with the duality of her existence. We are looking at a woman who defined a generation's pop culture with the cheerful, invincible phrase, "Save the cheerleader, save the world." But behind that iconic armor was a human being fighting an exhausting, decades-long internal war.
It's just devastating.
She leaves behind a young daughter, and she leaves behind a legacy that should force a reckoning regarding the commodification of children in entertainment. For you listening, this deep dive is a reminder of how we consume the daily barrage of celebrity news.
Right.
It is so easy to see a breaking alert, consume the tragedy as a fleeting piece of content, and just keep scrolling. But behind every sensationalized headline is a deeply human, terrifyingly fragile reality.
And the nuance of that reality is so easily lost in the modern media landscape. My core belief has always been that critical thinking and media literacy are only defenses in a world drowning in information overload. What actually provides a glimmer of hope in this devastating story is observing how this specific digital community chose to behave. They rejected the cheap dopamine of the tabloid headlines. They utilized their platform not to judge, but to share their own darkest vulnerabilities.
Offering radical empathy to a woman who desperately lacked a safe harbor in life.
Exactly.
It proves that the internet, even in its most gossip-driven corners, still has the capacity for profound humanity.
It does. But as the news cycle inevitably churns forward, this tragedy leaves us with a haunting question to consider. I'll leave you with this final thought to mull over.
Okay.
When a prominent figure whose entire existence from literal infancy was documented, commodified, and ruthlessly consumed by the public passes away so young, who ultimately owns their narrative in death?
Wow.
Do they finally achieve the peace and autonomy that was stolen from them in life? Or does the digital machine, that endless shifting cityscape of news tickers and timelines, just continue to rewrite their story, utilizing their memory as content long after they are gone?